Thank you. Thanks for joining me this late in the afternoon. I know we're all probably pretty tired. I'm very jet lagged. But I'm happy to be here today to talk about ideology and threats to evidence-based decision-making that affects families. I'm a scientist, and as Edward mentioned, I'm an associate professor of psychology at Colorado State University. My research has been primarily focused on parental alienation for the last 10 plus years. And I published in some of the top psychological science journals in the field. And research on parental alienation has grown considerably by 40%, even in the last since 2016. But despite this dramatic growth in scientific knowledge, I've seen resistance and denial to the scientific information grow in equal measure. And I'm a social psychologist, so I should not have been surprised. Kurt Lewin, who's considered the father of the field of social psychology, stated that when there's a push to change the status quo, we will be faced in equal measure with forces who want to maintain the status quo. And when change happens, the pushback is expected to be greater in return to go back to the original level that the status quo was originally set at. Now, scientific knowledge helps us advance public efforts. With scientific evidence, we can identify the causes of social problems and develop solutions to minimize and stop their impact. So we shouldn't be surprised that when scientific evidence starts to challenge the status quo and support change, there will be people who are not pleased with this change. And these people will engage in behaviors to return to the status quo. But how can these people be successful when the forces of change are based on science? Jilha and colleagues have defined science denial as the dismissal of well-established scientific evidence, or the dismissal of the scientific methods that we use to gather scientific evidence. This isn't the same as people having different opinions. It's about the rejection of scientific evidence that's pushing the status quo. And that denial can have profound negative impacts on individuals, societies, and our planet. Science denial lies along a spectrum, from denial being based on true skepticism, like believing the science on a topic hasn't settled yet, to having much more anti-scientific grounding, like rejecting the scientific method due to one's beliefs and motivations to preserve their beliefs. Now, how is science denial used? Hendricks and colleagues have argued that the general public has a limited understanding of the complexities of scientific research methods and statistics. For them to understand scientific information, they must access scientist experts, and they have to see them as credible and trustworthy sources of information, and then they need to accept what they're saying. Now, critics of shared parenting, gender-inclusive research on domestic violence, and parental alienation have targeted this process in their disinformation campaigns. Cook and colleagues describe examples of disinformation campaigns like making ad hominem attacks against experts to make people not trust them, like saying, Dr. Harman's unethical, or Dr. Harman is just an advocate, and so she's biased, so her research can't be trusted. Or they spread conspiracy theories about the scientist's goals, like saying, Dr. Harman is not a feminist because her research promotes an agenda that controls and is damaging to women. Or they use fake experts who spread misinformation that questions the very arguments that scientists are trying to communicate, like a professor who does not conduct or publish research herself, criticizing the methods of others who actually do the work. This disinformation campaign leads to the public being misled and misinformed. It's scientifically well established that people use mental shortcuts when they process information. And these shortcuts create systematic biases in our perceptions. For example, people might hear that someone has a PhD, and that makes them automatically think that they must know what they're talking about. Never mind that their PhD is in an unrelated field, or that the person has never done any research or practice in that particular area to actually have any expertise in it. Now, I don't have time today to cover the many different types of science denial techniques used by resistors of change. Instead, I'm going to focus on the fact that critics' tactics to disrupt and influence scientific knowledge is most powerful when the tactics confirm strong worldviews that the audience already has. When science denial techniques are tied to an ideological perspective, this leads to motivated reasoning, which is when people process information in a biased way based on their emotions and their beliefs in order to come to a conclusion that they want to happen. For example, a person will engage in motivated reasoning by searching for and giving more importance to information that supports their beliefs, overlooking and ignoring contradictory information. This is something we call confirmation bias. Now, our world is unpredictable and complex. Uncertainty creates anxiety, and it motivates people to find solutions. We want to feel safe. Ambiguities and uncertainties threaten that feeling of safety. And what makes people feel most safe are simple solutions. It's easy to settle onto something that just feels right or aligns with our existing beliefs. To entertain alternative explanations is to invite uncertainty back in, and people are motivated to prevent that. So when we have an ideology that offers an explanation for something as complex as family violence, people latch onto it, and they have a lot of difficulty explaining alternative explanations. So let's talk about the ideology that affects the field of parental alienation, shared parenting, and domestic violence. It's rooted in beliefs about gender. Many social science theories and research have focused on how beliefs about gender affect perceptions and behaviors. The content of the stereotypes we have for women and men are very similar to those expected for mothers and fathers. And these have not changed much since research started on this topic decades ago. Mothers and fathers, or men and fathers, are stereotyped as agentic and aggressive, and women and mothers as nurturing, weak, and in need of protection. The development of these stereotypes starts very early in life, as early as 2 years old. And the stereotypes are very difficult to change or to override. Of course, not everybody endorses these stereotypes, but it doesn't mean they don't affect us. When people are made to think about gender, it can unconsciously affect the way they process information about a person. This is one reason that ideologies tied to gender can affect the way people process information, even unconsciously. They also impact expectations we have for people, such that if people do not comply with expectations, they are dehumanized. For example, scientists have found that parental involvement is expected to be greater for mothers than fathers, because motherhood is seen as an essential and instinctual part of being a woman, to such an extent that there's a mandate that women should be mothers. This mandate affects not just normative expectations for women to be mothers and beliefs that there must be something wrong with them if they don't become a mother. It's also affected public policies like the tender years doctrine that presumed children were better off in the care with their mother during their tender or younger years of life. This led to policies that created inequity in allocation of custody by gender of the parent, with mothers historically given more or primary custody of children. It's also reflected in parenting plans for young children, where they say that they should spend most or all of their overnights with their mothers than their fathers after divorce. We also know that when mothers are found to have abused a child or abandoned them, they're punished more harshly than fathers, because she's expected to be a nurturer, not an abuser. Gender beliefs have also affected policies about intimate partner violence. In a 2022 co-edited book by Brenda Russell and John Hamel, the authors describe the gender paradigm, which frames intimate partner violence as a gendered problem, meaning that it's viewed as the use or threat of physical abuse or other forms of control by men against their intimate female partners to enforce their male privilege in patriarchal societies. These beliefs are closely tied to stereotypes about men being more aggressive than women and women lacking agency and autonomy in their relationships with men. This paradigm has affected laws like mandatory arrest laws and domestic violence calls in the United States, as well as requiring treatment for perpetrators of all types of family violence to receive treatment protocols rooted in gendered ideologies about violence. Yet scientific evidence and population-based estimates of violence and aggression have largely failed to find support for many of the assumptions of the gender paradigm, such as assumptions that women do not initiate or aggress for reasons other than self-protection. I refer you to this book for a lot of the more up-to-date research on this. And I'm not saying that there isn't any such thing as gender-based violence. No, but there are other types of violence and aggression and motivations for why people aggress. And they can't be explained by the gender paradigm. This perspective also fails to account for instances when men and people in same-sex relationships are victims of intimate partner violence. Now, someone recently told me that it was clear to them that this book was intended to discredit and undermine research on gender-based violence, even though they hadn't even read the book. Now, if that's not motivated reasoning, I don't know what is. Now, the gender paradigm of intimate partner violence is also evident in the area of parental alienation. Research and intervention work with parents who are victims of coercively controlling abuse have reported that a common strategy used by abusive parents is to use their children against their victims. For example, this diagram may look familiar to most of you. It's the power and control wheel developed by domestic violence practitioners using the Duluth model in their intervention work. This model was originally developed for the treatment of gender-based violence, with women as the primary victims. The women they treated reported that their partners were using their children against them, such as fathers threatening that they will never see their children again if they left the relationship. Now, there's been considerable research using large community samples of adults finding male victimization to be on par with female victimization on many types of violence and aggression. And in some studies, they're even more likely to be victims than women. And some of this research finds that both mothers and fathers have been victims of coercively controlling abuse, and they've had their children turned against them as part of the other parents' abusive behaviors. Now, parental alienation is a product of this coercively controlling abuse. Domestic violence research has stopped short in studying what happens to kids when they've been weaponized. It's not easy to weaponize a child because even a lot of children don't even reject the most abusive parents. The abusive parent has to make the child believe that their other parent never loved them, abandoned them, is unsafe or unfit. And when a child adopts that belief, they become alienated. Now, parental alienation is not primarily perpetrated by fathers, and so this violates many of the assumptions underlying the gender paradigm, and it actually aligns with a lot of the research conducted by scientists of intimate partner violence. For example, representative samples, we don't find gender differences in who's likely to be the target of parental alienating behaviors. In trial level and appellate level decisions, we find that mothers are the primary perpetrator of parental alienation about 70% of the time. It could be because of biases in how these cases are evaluated, money, resources, but either way, the data does not indicate that mothers are the only ones to have their children weaponized against them by an abusive partner. This challenges assumptions then that only women can be victims of coercively controlling abuse. And when they're faced with this empirical challenge to their beliefs, critics of parental alienation then engage in motivated reasoning to form a conclusion that makes sense to them, such as they will say, well, the mother must be protecting her children from an abusive parent if she's engaging in what we call parental alienating behaviors. This conclusion is made because it aligns with the belief that women and mothers only aggress in self-defense. They say the mother's justified in telling their children how horrible their father is because they should just know the truth and that the truth will protect them. Or they say, dads are just claiming to be victims of parental alienation in court because they are truly abusive and they want to deflect attention away from abuse allegations made against them because they want to control mothers through the use of their children. That conclusion is made because the belief is that men do not engage in self-defense and can't be victims. They're only aggressors. Or they will say all mothers are protective all the time, which is not true. Now, a lot of these critics will acknowledge that women can have their children turned against them by an abusive father. They just won't call it parental alienation. They will focus on the female victim in the family dynamic and argue that the children need to be protected from their abusive fathers. This is because that explanation is consistent with the gender paradigm, but it's not consistent with the empirical evidence. And the more research we publish on parental alienation, the more the critics push misinformation rooted in ideology to make it more impactful. To illustrate, I'm going to provide you a few examples from the book titled Challenging Parental Alienation, which was recently co-edited by Jean Mercer and Margaret Drew. They co-authored several chapters along with several other authors who've been longtime critics of parental alienation research. For over a year, I collaborated with a group of scholars consisting of scientists and practitioners to closely examine the contents of this book. We were initially planning to just write a book review and publish it in a peer-reviewed journal. But we found so much misinformation and science denial techniques that we decided to use the book as a case study of what we're seeing these authors and other authors in the book doing in their other published work. And we published our critique as a technical report. It's posted all over the internet. You can find it on the Parental Alienation Study Group website. Soon going to be available in Spanish as well. And to be clear, the focus of our critique was to identify misinformation and science denial strategies used by the authors. I'm not going to discuss those here because we're going to do that in other presentations. My focus here is to highlight the gender paradigm or the ideology used by the authors to make their misinformation more impactful on their readers. The title of their book states that it's intended for professionals and parents, so the impact of the misinformation has the potential to harm many people. One of the authors, Suzanne Zakur, describes herself on her website as a feminist researcher and speaker who's pursuing her doctorate in law at Oxford University. This author made many unsupported statements throughout her book chapter that reflect an ideology that mothers are better parents than fathers, and that research indicating otherwise is not valid. For example, on page 194 of her chapter, Zakur calls shared parenting a paradigm that presumes each parent is equally important and responsible for the child. And to bolster her argument, she adds that this paradigm exists no matter who the primary caregiver was while the parents resided together. Now, the primary caregiver is usually the mother, so she's implying here that this relationship is the most important one. The premise of shared parenting challenges that assumption and is therefore wrong in her view. She, along with all the other authors, I'm going to spoiler alert here. She, along with many of the other authors, call parental alienation just a belief system held by a minority of people that's not supported by scientific evidence. Now, I'm not going to discuss all the reasons why that statement is wrong, but what she writes next reflects this gendered ideology that she's using to oppose shared parenting and parental alienation. She says, the parental alienation belief system has thus greatly benefited from the empirically dubious idea that father's involvement should be increased and that children benefit from frequent and regular contact with both parents, an idea that's gained in traction because of its seemingly egalitarian quality. Zakur implies Well, let me give you the next one and I'll tell you what it's. Fathers' rights groups have adopted the parental alienation vocabulary and managed to convey in popular discourse the myth that fathers are the underdogs in custody evaluation, and that this is a grave injustice to be redressed. So she's implying here that fathers' rights groups are trying to maintain power in custody disputes, reflecting this ideology about gender and violence, ignores considerable research that fathers are actually often the ones at disadvantage in custody dispute. And she calls fathers' disadvantage a myth and offers no empirical support to back up her statement. For the reader who holds the same ideology as Zakur or leans in that direction, reading these sentences aligns with pre-existing beliefs about gender and parenthood, and it lowers the likelihood of engaging in critical thinking about the arguments that she's making. Now, there are fathers who abuse mothers by using their children against them, but it can also be true that mothers can abuse fathers by using their children. Both can be true. It's not either or. Yet people's desire to make the world a simpler place is what leads to this reasoning. Science is not so definitive, and advocating for an either or definitive world does a violence to what it means to be a human. If you were felt offended by reading these statements, it's probably because these words are intended to dehumanize you. Here's another example of statements Zakur makes in her chapter. She says, as a review of the social science literature concludes, the research suggests that children do not necessarily benefit from greater contact with their non-custodial parent. Rather, it's the type of parenting the non-custodial parent engages in, not the amount of time the parent spends with the children, that's most significant. Now, the social science literature could contain anything. I don't know exactly what she reviewed, and it's not specific to what studies actually she was using to support her argument. And in years of parent-child attachment research, we know that there's nothing that supports this statement. And her next sentence further illustrates this problem. She says, the research also indicates that children do not fare better post-divorce in joint custody arrangements than they do in sole custody. And some children, including those in high conflict families, may fare worse. In other words, courts are preventing children from seeing their mothers under the pretext that children need both parents. Now, if there's any question that there's a gender-based ideology regarding motherhood to support her argument, that answers it. Now, a leading expert in the field of shared parenting tried to contact Zakur and asked her, what research did you actually use to support any of these things? You made these two statements. What review did you do? She never responded to her. Another chapter in the book is written by two law professors, Julie Doughty and Margaret Drew. Doughty is at Cardiff University and Drew is at University of Massachusetts. Drew's also the co-editor of the book itself. You may note here that all the three authors I've mentioned so far are attorneys and self-identified child and domestic violence advocates, and most of the authors of the book are. And in this quote from their chapter, we're going to see an example of a science denial technique called nefarious intent, which is a strategy to make the scholar or scientist appear to have some wicked intention to cause harm. They wrote language and Cold War propaganda about brainwashing and mind control in communist regimes that had caught the public imagination in the 1950s was appropriated to enliven his, Gardner's, idea that some mothers induce false memories and beliefs in their children. So here they start with equating the work of Dr. Richard Gardner, one of the early scholars in this field, with the propaganda used by communist regimes to brainwash people, providing no evidence to make such a connection. Children are influenced by their parents. That is what parenting is. Children are also highly suggestible, and research indicates that mothers are particularly effective in getting children to recall false and incorrect memories. The authors imply here that mothers somehow have no ability to have this kind of influence, presumably because they can do no wrong. Likening Gardner's idea that mothers induce false memories and beliefs in children to Cold War propaganda also makes the reader question the intent of Gardner's work to undermine the message he's trying to communicate. Let me give you one more example of how this ideology is interwoven across much of the statements made by authors in the book. Again, this ideology magnifies their misinformation and science denial tactics among their readers. The next quote comes from a chapter written by Margaret Drew, again, along with Jean Mercer, who's an emeritus professor from Stockton University, whose training is in developmental psychology. She's known for being a child advocate and the founder of Advocates for Children in Therapy. The authors talk about the role of experts in family court, saying that family court judges have essentially turned over their authority to experts who are neutral parties for the court. And they put neutrals into quotes to make the reader suspicious that the experts are really neutral at all. And it also serves to make judges appear like they're being duped by biased professionals. And what they say next indirectly reflects the gender ideology that's being used to influence the reader. They say, but parental alienation advocates often assign sinister intentions to mothers, thus discrediting the mother before she can have an opportunity to fully present her case in the court. This statement first implies that allegations of parental alienation are only leveraged against mothers. Again, this is untrue. By failing to mention the studies that contradict that fact, it's presented as if parental alienation is a conspiracy used by fathers to harm mothers. The same assumption is pervasive across the writings of other authors of the book, particularly the chapter written by Professor Joan Meyer. Second, when there are allegations of any type of abuse, we infer intention. If a father's accused of child abuse, assumptions are made about his character and motivations. Why does this standard not apply to mothers who are accused of psychological abuse? The statement also implies that no one should question why a mother engages in behaviors to undermine the child's relationship with the other parent. She must have a good reason for it, because women supposedly only aggress in self-defense. She should be allowed to present her case before any intention is assigned. But this is not done for fathers with other kinds of abuse, where people are assumed guilty before proven innocent in family court in order to be cautious and protect alleged victims. Now, this statement made by Mercer and Drew reflects a biased assumption that when mothers engage in what we call parental alienating behaviors, this is more acceptable than when a father does the same. In a study I published in the Journal of Family Psychology a few years ago, we presented participants with a list of bad parenting behaviors that parents may do, and we asked them to rate how acceptable they were. And they rated relationship minimizing and gatekeeping behaviors, such as how acceptable it would be for a generic parent, a father, or a mother to ask the child's school to limit contact with the other parent, or to intercept calls or messages coming from the other parent to the child. These were rated on a 5-point scale, and people generally thought these behaviors were unacceptable. But they were rated as more acceptable for a mother than a father or a generic parent. This is a small but statistically significant difference. They also rated behaviors that encourage loyalty, like rewarding the child for rejecting the other parent, and negative portrayal behaviors like belittling the other parent in front of the child. And as before, this was rated significantly more acceptable for a mother to do than a generic parent. People thought there must have been some justifiable reason that a mother would engage in these unacceptable behaviors. This finding also supports forensic psychology research, where there's a tendency for people to attribute the cause of women's violent behavior to biological or psychological factors that are outside of her control, when the violent actions of men are often attributed to situational factors that are within his control. This happened once when I posted a news story like this one on Twitter about a year or two ago. In April of 2021, a mother killed her 3 children in the midst of a custody dispute. And after I posted it, someone tweeted in response, "How do you know she wasn't just protecting her children from an abusive father?" Okay. Now, what if I posted a picture of a father who had killed himself and his child in the midst of a custody dispute. Would that tweeter have assumed he was just protecting his child from an abusive mother? I don't think so, because that would violate the gender paradigm. Now, Mercer and Drew also argue in the same quote that the motives for mother's behavior is discredited by parental alienation advocates prior to even hearing her side of the story, which presumably is that she's just protecting her child from an abusive father. Again, this reflects a presumption that women are not aggressive, or that they would not do things like tell a child that their father never loved them without a good reason, or undermine the father's parental authority without good reason, or, oh, that didn't go away. That was meant to be, or call this person your dad without good reason, even though it's not their dad, or block phone calls, or fail to relay messages without good reason, or say negative things about their father without good reason, or withdraw love and affection from the child when the child says something positive about their father without good reason. If a parent is truly abusive, there are ways to protect a child from abuse without using these kinds of behaviors. Those are parental alienating behaviors. These behaviors are abusive, regardless of who does them. And the gender paradigm, however, serves to give mothers more of a pass to be abusive in this way. And if you question that, you are labeled as somebody who discredits women's experiences. Today, people are expected to use evidence to inform important decisions regarding health, public policy, and behaviors. And the source of that evidence is usually obtained from the media, because the public often doesn't have direct access to or the background to understand scientific evidence. Most people accept science, but for those invested in maintaining the status quo, they're going to find ways to make people not trust science that goes against their beliefs. They try to discredit the scientists, to question their motives. They generate false information and disseminate it widely in the media. The consequence is that the misinformation in the media has more influence than the scientific information. And scientists have found there's a lot of confusion today because of misinformation being spread in the media about a wide variety of issues. The confusion then leads to the development of conspiracy theories, and it undermines the legitimacy of evidence-based interventions. Even more disturbing is research shows that people's evidence-based decisions are more strongly impacted by their prior beliefs than beliefs about the quality of the evidence itself. Now, I identify as a feminist, despite what my critics say. And what do I mean by this? Most definitions of feminism are variants of this. It's a belief in social, economic, and political equality of the sexes. And this is what I stand for. Yet the examples I've provided you today from quotes written by alleged women's rights advocates don't support that. They're using the gender paradigm to protect only one kind of victim, and that doesn't promote equality. I think John Hamel and Brenda Russell captured my feelings on the matter well in their recent book regarding domestic violence. They said, aside from stymieing our collective efforts to reduce rates of intimate partner violence in our communities effectively, the gender paradigm, vigorously defended by individuals who see themselves as champions of women's rights, continues to rely upon anachronistic principles and dismisses empirically based research, which can lead to benevolent sexist ideologies that only serve to reinforce tired stereotypes about women as helpless, childlike creatures who lack agency. Now, the reinforcement of stereotypes does not lead to greater equality. Those pushing this agenda are not pushing for social change. Whether they realize it or not, they are maintaining the status quo, which ultimately prevents equal rights for women. Now, whether you study with, work with, or advocate for issues related to parental alienation, shared parenting, or domestic violence, we all share the same problem: a gendered ideology that serves to suppress and discredit anything that challenges it, and policies and laws that are built around it. We see this happening right now in state legislatures across the United States, where critics are pushing for the implementation of Caden's law, which we heard Dr. Dieter talk about earlier. We see it in similar legislation in Canada and other parts of the world. Such legislation creates and reinforces social inequality, and it harms many families. My hope is that we all work together and address the shared problem. We are not working in unrelated fields. We all share the same challenge, and divided, they win. We know how critics of our efforts use misinformation and science denial to push back. We know the ideological beliefs that motivate them. Now we have to create creative solutions to push forward. The scientific work on shared parenting, parental alienation, and intimate partner violence continues to accumulate. How long can critics resist this pressure that's driving for evidence-based change? Well, they can keep being persistent and strong if we don't find ways to call out what they're doing, to correct their misinformation campaigns, and to disseminate our research more widely, particularly to those in powerful positions to affect the lives of families. I encourage everybody here to find ways to do that together. Thank you.
Okay, we have some time for questions, comments, and observations from folks. Yes. Oh, okay. Just get the microphone to you.
Thinking a little bit about the European perception on some things that you mentioned, what comes right into my mind is the Istanbul Convention. I don't know if you talked about that today, and I would like to hear some words from your side, because this seemingly has a very powerful influence in the legislation. And I can see that also in the German legislation changes things. And I think under the aspect of false accusations and all this stuff, I think this seems to be really strong.
I think our dissection of that book kind of be a model what other people can do to other policies and other books. I mean, it's everywhere. You can see the ideology reflected in the language used, and the selective use of certain research to support an agenda, ignoring all the other research. We see that in shared parenting. We see that with domestic violence. We see it in all of these fields. But yeah, I agree. I think that there's definitely, this isn't something unique to the US. This is all over the world. It's reflected in all these policies that we're seeing right now, including what's happening with Grevio and the Istanbul Convention. It's everywhere.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Even Mellan from Norway. I know that a person in Scotland, a family therapist called Nick Charles, suggested that we could meet halfway with the domestic violence movement and abstain from using the concept of parental alienation and instead substituting it with coercive control, because that is a concept also accepted by the domestic violence movement. What do you think about that suggestion?
Well, first, I already talk about it as coercive controlling abuse. As I mentioned in my talk, where coercive controlling abuse scientists have stopped is looking at the impact on the child and what it means to become a weapon. And so we call that parental alienation. You can call it anything, As Dr. Dieter talked about earlier, the laws that are being passed across the country in the United States right now don't even use the word parental alienation, but it's still anti-parental alienation legislation. So it doesn't matter what we call it. I mean, we have to have scientific definitions. When I do my research, we have to have common language and terminology. So that's why we settled on a word. But coercive control is more a description of the family dynamic. The alienation is the outcome. So there's behaviors and outcomes, and they're different things. And I do work a lot with domestic violence scientists, and they are in the same boat that I am. They're being attacked by the radical advocates. They're rejecting the science that they are producing about domestic violence that shows that it is not all gender-based violence. There is gender-based violence, but there's lots of kinds of violence. There's lots of aggression. There's lots of motivations for aggression. There isn't one answer, but people want one answer. Well, some people want one answer. I don't.
I just wanted to follow up on that a little bit because of what I've learned here in Athens, speaking to several people from Europe, is that the very term parental alienation is kind of considered to be a taboo now. So even those who are working in the field of parental alienation are abandoning this word or this term and substituting it with other kind of terminology. And yet those who are affected by parental alienation, are wanting to hold on to the term because it kind of reflects what they've gone through. So should we be abandoning or should people be abandoning the term, or should we just stick to our guns? And
well, for me, it's you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you keep using the term, we have common terminology or definitions. If we use a different term, they will demonize that term too. It doesn't matter. They'll demonize it. They'll use it. So if you change it, and then if you try to use a different term, they'll say, look, you're trying to distance yourself from the term because it's not acceptable. So you're trying to create it into something else to make it more acceptable. So they use it against you no matter what you do. So I don't agree that it's just stay away from the term. The intent of it is to make the term toxic so that it silences everybody who's trying to study this and work in it.
Yeah, I would just like to add and precise what Edward said. It's not that we were trying to avoid the term. What we did years ago was we had a German translation for the term, which is basically the same word, but in German. But the fact is, it's not that we are trying to avoid it, but whenever you use that term in Switzerland, for instance, you risk that your reputation is damaged immediately as someone who is on a professional basis, So you have to, if you want to be listened, if you want to be heard, you have to avoid the term. There's no choice.
Well, I want to suggest the Spanish method to use it, to go on with that, is just to ban by law the use of parental alienation. So we passed a law, we call it in Spain organic law, which is a law with constitutional rank. If you use the term parental alienation, it's forbidden, and now they are thinking about possibility to sanction you for using that. And what happened there, every party from right to left voted for that law, but extreme right. So now you are against the law, you belong to the extreme right area. And there has another side effect, and that only they are women, mothers that have been alienated, but now they see, okay, if we accept to see ourselves, because I think the key to change have women, because they cannot say that's a gender issue, but now they can feel protected, because if you are a woman, you are protected because you are a victim, and you weaken the movement against parental alienation. So another side effect, which is pernicious, I would say.
Thank you. Anthony Kauke from Malta. We've started using this term as well. As you know, Jennifer, I've met you about 5 years ago or 6. And we made a campaign there, and we got the same rejection and the same resistance, obviously. But we started changing a little bit to family well-being and prevention and education and early interventions rather than the end of result. Just like the gentleman was mentioning, Nick Child, we speak a lot to David Curl in Australia. And so therefore we need to go before the end result, as you mentioned, I believe. And the government did come along and using this word parental alienation. They did study, they did a technical committee. Mary Gauci here next to me was present on that committee. Still, studies is not enough. So the rebut that we got from the Women's Rights Foundation and extreme radical feminist is the same situation, that doesn't exist, and so and so and so. You already mentioned this. Still, the government is on board. We've convinced him that this is happening. It is there, it exists. So it's a matter of, I think, prevention, support, and therapy is well our vision for healthier children. So we need to go at education level before. And our motto is that children and families do not belong in court. So if we can go before, because parents needs to be healed, not more litigation, and the process takes time. The judge here yesterday agreed. It takes, and I have a motto saying, every second, every minute, every hour, every day, every week that passes by, every month, every year, away from that parent just because of false allegations, false abuse, is doing a lot of harm and damage to that child. So let's go before prevention, support, and therapy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we have a lot of hands up. We actually don't have time for too many more questions. If you could keep your questions very brief. Maybe Tim in the back, and maybe one more, Yanis after, and then we'll have to. Sorry, I'm just taking it in the order of hands
Thanks, Edward.
appearing.
Thanks, Jennifer. First of all, I'd like to thank you. It was a lot of tools to actually understand the communication that's coming towards us. And on the other hand, you said we all need to work together. And I think that's an important point, and we need to find actually ways to get this operational, because what we are facing, I've heard from the last speaker, the government is complicit. But in fact, it's the government who drives this, who pays NGOs, foundations, a lot of more people, billions, not small amounts of money, billions looking worldwide, in Germany, at least high amounts of millions, to these organizations to actually enforce these tools into society, by associations, by journalists who are paid by these associations. And where's the way to actually counter that? I mean, we're all engaged people in one way or the other, or one more other professionals, civil society, scientists, of course. But where could we envision a platform to actually counter this? Thinking about Greece, we're in Greece. We had the law reform in 2021. I was asking this to Yanis the other day. There was a ton of messaging from UN, Amnesty International, all kinds of NGOs saying, oh, the bad right-wing Greek government is going against women and mothers and stuff. And this is actually, I feel powerless against this. How can we go against this kind of messaging?
And one final comment. Do you want to address that, or wait for the next question?
I really just say I don't know the
To
answer.
Yanis.
We have to. I'm assuming that hopefully all the creative minds in this room can come up with some solutions. Best I could do is call it out. I've been told that to combat misinformation in the public health area, people say the best thing you can do is just call it out, call it out. All I've gotten in response is attacks. My hope is that people continue to support the scientists working in this area, protect them so they can keep doing the research that they're doing to help our cause, find ways to communicate better messaging. I don't know, find good investigative reporters who can actually not promote an agenda. I'm not sure how to do it. I don't know. I've been brainstorming for a couple of years and I still don't have any ideas. I'm not I'm a scientist, so it's not easy for me to come up with those ideas. I come up with other ideas, lots of research ideas, but I can't come up with that stuff. And I hope that the minds in this room and who are watching can start to do that. And work together to do it. So.
Okay, and final word to Yanis.
Because I was asked, the new law in Greece describes the parental alienation as the breach of relations between parents, and the consequence is the deprivation of parental authority. I haven't seen that applied yet. On the contrary, I have seen so many decisions where it is literally stated it is an alienated child, with all facts establishing the conclusion, obviously. And the decision goes on, and the order of the court is a typical visitation regulation right, as usually, 1 weekend over 2, etc., etc. Which means the court states that there exists parental alienation, and they attribute a pretentious visitation. If it was not parental alienation, the term used, but family violence or any other similar term, emotional abuse, then it would be some consequence. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you. And that concludes this session. We now have parallel panel sessions, followed by parallel roundtable sessions, and then we'll end with the conference conclusions.